You are listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast, Episode 2. Today we're talking about the different types of property and how ownership is conveyed. So let's get started.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hey everybody, welcome again to the Mineral Rights Podcast. This is your host, Matt Sands. If this is your first time listening, then thanks for joining us. And just a reminder that the Mineral Rights Podcast show notes and links to more information that are discussed can be found at mineralrightspodcast.com. Please check out the site and subscribe. Let's go ahead and get into today's show. Today's episode is going to be talking a little bit about the ways that we transfer ownership, and we're going to really just focus on the most common ways to transfer ownership and the most common forms of royalties that we're going to run into. There are also more complicated or more complex situations that you might run into, and we'll have some more information in the show notes that you can go do some more research if that applies to you. So first out, we're going to talk about property, and we need to define the term property before we get started and kind of talk about how it relates to mineral rights. So first of all, property can be classified as either real or personal. Real property is the land and any associated permanent fixtures like buildings, homes, and so forth. And personal property is basically everything else. Since oil and gas is considered to be part of the land, oil and gas mineral rights are considered a form of real property. In most countries, minerals belong to the government, but in the U.S., ownership of minerals was originally granted to the surface owners, and this type of ownership is called fee simple or a unified estate, and we'll describe this in a little bit more detail later in the show. Ownership of itself is the exclusive right to possess and use the property. So when you talk about transfer of ownership, what we're talking about is transferring the right to possess or transferring the right to use that property. Pretty straightforward. Now, when you talk about transferring the ownership, there are really two legal methods that we're going to talk about today. That is through death, in other words, through a will, or through the purchase or sale. So that's through a deed. And that is a conveyance document. You'll hear that term conveyance, but the deed is the most common form of conveying real property interest. And the thing that is really important is that you have to have a proper legal description of that property in order for that transfer of ownership to be enforceable. And you're probably asking, what is a legal description? And this can get somewhat complicated. There are several different survey systems used across the U.S. And to learn more about that, I'll include a link in the show notes with some more worked examples so that you can really understand how that is described and how it's used. But just briefly, I'll say that a legal description is a written description with the purpose of delineating a specific piece of real property. And this, again, could include minerals. And again, getting it right is the most important part of any mineral or other land transaction. One of the terms that you'll hear is it must be sufficient in order to identify the correct tract of land. In other words, it must allow for the property in question to be identified on the surface of the earth or on the ground with a reasonable level of certainty. Okay, so now I'll go into the four main types of ownership with minerals. What this represents is property rights. And so each of these different ownership types have different rights, and I'll talk about those. So the first is a fee simple. And what this is the absolute ownership of a property for an indefinite duration. And they own the rights to both the surface and the minerals. So a fee simple owner has the right to grant a mineral lease. The next type is severed minerals. Many states in the U.S. allow mineral rights to be owned separately from the surface rights. And when this happens, it's called a split estate. This occurs when the original fee simple owner transfers ownership of only the subsurface minerals or just the surface rights while keeping the minerals. So oftentimes you'll hear of a situation where maybe someone has a large tract of land, maybe they're a rancher or farmer that passed down through the generations. The farm or ranch closes, but they want to keep the mineral rights. So that is where they may sell the surface rights but keep the mineral rights, and that's a severed minerals in that case. When minerals are severed or split from that surface right, it's done using a deed. And the person who now owns the mineral interest is called the mineral owner. Now, typically, the mineral owner is still entitled to the use of the surface as necessary for recovering any minerals. The next type that we'll talk about is surface rights. Someone who owns the surface rights only has the rights to the surface land and the associated fixtures. And again, think buildings or houses when I say fixtures. So the surface owner does not have the right to grant an oil and gas lease. Finally, the last type of ownership we'll talk about today is the concept of a royalty owner. And in oil and gas, the royalty owner has the right to receive a royalty or a share of production, but they cannot grant an oil and gas lease or receive the associated bonuses or rental payments. So we'll go through those four types again. So we talked about fee simple, which is absolute ownership of both surface and subsurface or minerals. Severed minerals, which is just separate ownership of the mineral rights. Surface rights, which is the separate ownership of just the surface land. And then royalty ownership. Okay, let's dive into the concept of royalty ownership now. So there are three main types of royalty interests that we'll talk about. And these are created again through a conveyance document or a clause in a lease. The first that we're going to talk about is an overriding royalty interest, or an ORRI. A lot of times this is just called an override, and this is a type of royalty interest that is created from the working interest. And we haven't talked about that yet, but a working interest is something we'll get into in a lot more detail in a future episode. Just know for now that it is ownership in an oil and gas lease that grants the owner the right to explore, to drill, to produce oil and gas from a tract. Working interest owners are obligated to pay a corresponding percentage of the cost of those activities. So unlike a mineral owner who gets the share of the production free of any cost, the working interest owner also has to pay the percentage of the expenses based on the percentage of working interest owned. And the thing to note with a working interest owner is the portion of the production revenue are paid after the royalties are paid. So they are also entitled to a share in production with the other royalty interest owners. Okay, so what happens with the override, it's similar to other royalty interests in that it is not responsible for the cost of producing the oil and gas, but it only shares in the production of the oil and gas as long as the associated lease is in effect. So unlike minerals, which last in perpetuity, an override is tied to the lease. So once that production stops and that lease expires, the override also goes away. All right, the next type of interest, royalty interest, is called a non-participating royalty interest, or NPRI. And this is similar to the override that we just talked about in that it is an interest in the gross production of the oil and gas or other minerals, free of the cost. But in this case, it is not carved out of the lease or the working interest portion. It's actually carved out of the mineral estate as a free royalty. The difference between an NPRI and other mineral ownership types is the fact that it does not carry with it the right to participate in the execution of an oil and gas or mineral lease, or to receive any of the bonus payments or delay rentals that go along with it. So in other words, the owner of that mineral fee estate keeps those rights. So you still get that portion of the royalty out of the mineral estate, but you cannot sign that lease. You don't decide the terms of the lease or anything like that. And the final one we're going to talk about today, just briefly, is a concept of payment out of production. This is related to the overriding royalty interest in that it's usually created from the working interest, but it doesn't bear the cost of production. And where it differs from an override is this production payment terminates upon the payment of a specified sum of money. So not something that will go on through the entirety of the lease per se. It might have a finite time associated with it. So that covers a few of these concepts and terms you've heard about as it relates to ownership of minerals and transferring ownership, and what are the main types of royalty interests that are out there. There are a lot of different nuances associated with this concept, and this only scratches the surface of this, but remember that you can check out the show notes and there'll be some links there that you can go do some more research if you have a more complicated or need some more information on any of these particular interest types. Now, before I close, I'm going to talk also about how some of these royalty interests are used. So one of the things that many people don't know is that if you have mineral rights and you need cash today, but you would like to keep those mineral rights or keep a portion of them, what you could do is you could actually use a non-participating royalty interest. And one option is to use that non-participating royalty interest to sell a portion of your interest to generate a lump sum of cash, but then you can still maintain the control over the remainder of your minerals and the remainder of your revenue interest that'll be left after that MPRI is carved out. And whatever your situation, always remember to consult with a qualified person like an attorney before signing any agreements or conveyance documents associated with your minerals. So hopefully this was of help to you today, and I want to sincerely thank you again for joining me on the Mineral Rights Podcast. If you found value in this episode, please subscribe on whatever site or device you're using to listen, and that way you won't miss any future episodes. And stay tuned for the next episode, because I think you'll find it really helpful in making sure you're getting paid what you deserve when it comes to your royalty checks. And one last thing before I go, if you have any suggestions for future topics or any feedback, please email me at feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com, or you can leave a voice message at 720-580-2088. Thanks again for listening. I appreciate you, and until next time.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.